Well, thank you so much for that gracious welcome. I am going to talk some about both limits and possibilities today. I thought, in fact, of starting off with what would be my biggest limit, and to introduce to you, given the date on the calendar, a new statistical model for tracking student achievement that's going to be implemented by ATS in the fall. But given the kind of assessment anxiety that I've experienced as I move around my schools, I thought there'd probably be a good number of people in the room that wouldn't find that even as funny at all. So instead, I'm going to talk more generally, and again, big picture, try to make it a little bit engaging for you all, about the topic that was given to me, which is emerging issues in assessment. I want to start with a couple of things to maybe set the space. And one is that I want to acknowledge that at ATS there are 4 of us who serve as directors of accreditation and institutional evaluation. Not my favorite job title in the world. But the 4 of us serve the 270-some ATS member schools. We divide that number by 4. We each have a quarter of the schools. And we're all equally prepared to talk about things like assessment and other things related to accreditation. So you may have done this in the opening this morning that I wasn't part of, but I want to point out my colleagues in the back on my left, Lester, on the back on my right, Tom, up front here, Barbara, and me. And so even though I'll be the body that'll be talking to you for the next hour, I want to invite you to follow up with any of the 4 of us. And if you don't know who your school's liaison is, you can just go to the ATS webpage. Under membership, you'll find your school's information, and one of our names will be there. And we'd invite you to be in contact with us anytime that it's helpful. Feel free to drop us an email, and we'd be happy to consult with you about any of these sorts of pieces. I also kind of, again, in setting the room, first I want to say I'm just getting over a cold, so I've got a coffee here, and I hope you will allow me the informality of taking my breaks. And I want to offer to you that same sort of informality. It's early in the morning for some of you, depending where you've come from. If you need to get up and move around, I won't be at all bothered during this. My hope, and I'm always kind of wrong on this, but my hope is to present for about 45 minutes and to leave half an hour for question and answer. I'd also invite, if there's something that I bring up that kind of strikes you as I'm going along, try to get my attention and we'll stop and have a discussion as we're going. And then the last detail piece is that Reggie let me know that we'll be sharing these presentations with you after the fact. I see a lot of machines that are open right now if you'd like to follow along. This will be a Prezi presentation, which is similar to PowerPoint, but a little less linear. I do reusable and accessible Prezis, which means if you just Google Prezi Debbie Creamer Assessment, you'll find this on the web. You're more than welcome, if you get super inspired, to take it and change it and use it in your own context if you want. So those of you who are at a bigger shop who might want to go back and share some of this, if there are bits and pieces that are useful, you're welcome to do it. I also tweeted it out this morning, so if you're on Twitter, I'm at DRD Creamer, and that's in little print over here on the side. All right, I think those are all my preface sorts of things, so let me take it into the things that I wanted to try to raise today. And as I said, the topic that was given to me was emerging issues in assessment. And beyond something like a broad new statistical package or a new government regulation, as I was thinking about what's emerging, what really came to me were a couple of the things that have struck me as I've come to ATS. So as the introduction said, I was at a member school for about 15 years. During that time, I was involved with our accreditation and assessment processes. Since I've come to ATS, I've had the privilege of working with about 70 schools and reviewing assessment reports from many, many of them. How many of you know if your school's done an assessment report for ATS in the last few years? So even just with that, that's at least half of the room. So those that you've written, we all have read. So I've got a little bit of a sense of what's going on at some of the schools. And as I thought about what's been emerging, particularly over the last couple of years, I've had a couple of experiences that have been my piece of reflection and might resonate with you as well. One, to start with a positive, is to say theological schools in general have been pretty good at some parts of assessment all along. So we're not newbies to this. We haven't never done assessment. Many of our schools have been very good at the assessment of individual students. This is often very true at the MDiv level for students who are going into ministry settings, but is also true kind of across the board. As we think about particular students and their readiness to move out of a class or their readiness to graduate, or their readiness for ministry or for another vocational placement. Many of our schools are very good at looking at that particular student and thinking of how that particular student has done. Most of us who are teachers are also pretty good at thinking about our own courses. Our schools have been doing course evaluations, I think, since the cavemen were writing them on pieces of rock, to at least get feedback from students about what they've liked and what felt successful to them and what didn't. And I know as a teacher, I often would find myself in hallways chit-chatting with other faculty members when a class went particularly badly. What happened? Why did that happen? What can I do differently next time? Or celebrating the successes that come when something goes well. So those are two pieces we've been pretty good at. The pieces that I think that ATS schools or theological schools more broadly have been learning into lately have been thinking about degree program assessment and institutional assessment. And this is probably old news for those of you who've had a really steady hand in assessment, because for the last probably 5-8 years, this has been a very important theme. When the ATS standards were revised during 2010-2012, became really highlighted in each of the degree program standards and in the educational standard that schools needed to look not just at the student and not just at the course, but at the overall effectiveness of the degree program. Let me see again, I'm going to keep you awake for a little bit. So how many of you are familiar with that kind of focus on degree program outcomes? So that's almost all of the room. As we've grown into that, and as we've thought about institutional assessment more broadly, so not just thinking of what the dean's office does maybe, but also thinking of the other departments and areas of the school, we're growing into it, and we're growing into it at what I think is a B level. Now, many of us who've been in grad school for a while, B is a bad grade. So I want to hold that kind of awareness with a sense that what does B mean in the abstract? A little better than average, right? So pretty good, not stellar, but pretty good. For me, as I'm thinking about a B level, I'm really starting to think about three things: burnout, boredom, and bureaucracy. Again, let me see the room. Do any of those three words resonate with you? Or not with you personally, of course, but with other people at your institution who might name one of those three things as a concern within your assessment process? I'm only seeing a few shy hands, but I'm actually seeing a lot of faces that seem to look like some awareness there. This, for me, as I go to schools or as I review assessment plans, these are some of the things that are really standing out to me about assessment right now. There feels like at a lot of institutions, maybe not yours, but you could imagine hypothetically at some institutions, a beginning of a feeling of burnout. Now, many of your shops probably have been experiencing burnout, again, since the cavemen were writing on clay tablets. But the kind of burnout that comes with assessment plans lately has seemed like schools assessing by collecting more and more and more data. Each time it seems not quite good enough, somebody adds another layer of work on top of it. To the point where at some of the schools I've visited lately, it seems like if it can be measured, it's being measured. And often with big piles of paper that then are circulated in ways that lead to that sense of exhaustion. One of my favorite pieces of the ATS standards around educational assessment is this one. An effective plan of assessment should be as simple and sustainable as possible while adequate to answer fundamental questions. As you think about the assessment, either that's done at your institution in general or in your DMIN program, how many of you feel like you have a plan that's as simple and sustainable as possible? Okay, that's actually really makes me feel good. So that was a quarter of the hands maybe went up, which is actually a little bit more than I had expected. Again, as I see a lot of plans that are just not as simple and sustainable as possible. And again, those languages are in the standards the same way that says that a DMIN degree ought to have an outcome project like a thesis. So this is up there as a significant statement. Another piece that I sometimes will encounter is a level of boredom. So when I'm on a site visit, we meet with administrators and then we talk with faculty. And again, you can imagine hypothetically, not at your school, but hypothetically, there probably are some faculty in some places who just aren't that jazzed about assessment. Do you have any of those folks at your shop? No, nobody has that at their shop. The experience sometimes is one of these. where either you or the person who is responsible for assessment of your degree or of your school walks into the faculty meeting and says, today we're talking about assessment. And rather than going, woohoo, they might not be quite this blatant, but you would see that all the screens are up and the screens aren't really looking at the same sort of thing that you're interested in that day, right? I always ask as I'm working with schools, are you learning anything from your assessment process? Does it stimulate your curiosity and your creativity? Can it surprise you? If your assessment plan can't surprise you, I would be putting my head down on the table too. There are enough things to be engaged with that if your assessment plan isn't going to bring you anything new or doesn't have the possibility of bringing you something new, I would ask why it is that we would be devoting that much time to it. And then the last piece, and I know this is funny for me to stand up here with my ATS name tag and talk about bureaucracy, but there is a sense at many schools, and again, I'm sure not yours, but a sense that the reason that we do assessment is because we're supposed to do assessment. So either our accrediting body tells us that we're supposed to, or if you're an embedded school, maybe you've got somebody in an institutional office that's really gung-ho to it, and you do it because they tell you to, or there'll be problems if you don't. It's been really hard, I think, to help remind schools that the reason we do assessment isn't for the sake of doing assessment. Why do we do assessment? To improve student learning. And if we can keep that focus, that it's not assessment for assessment's sake, but it's assessment for student learning's sake. I always like to draw the caveat here, and I'll do two actually. One is to talk about a difference between student outcomes and student learning outcomes. That's technical, there's no test at the end of this piece, so you don't need to know which are which. But student outcomes are one of the things I've been hearing a whole lot in the press lately, particularly thinking at the undergraduate level, sometimes at the for-profit level, or at degree schools that have questionable accreditation status. Are they graduating enough students? Are they placing enough students? Those are student outcomes. And at one level, it's really important to keep an eye on those. So at my institution, it would be really important to know if it used to be that I graduated all my DMINs and they all graduated within 3.5 years, and now 2 years later, it's taking them 6 years and only half of them are getting through. I want to keep my eye on that. That matters for some reason. It's going to trigger other questions. But if some of you are in programs that graduate all your students, and others are in programs that graduate 2/3 of your students, and some are in programs that take 3 years, and some are in programs that take 5 years as an average, which of those programs do students learn more in? You don't know, right? I could start in my basement, if I had a basement, a diploma mill offering a Doctor of Ministerial Leadership. If you send me $5,000, I will get on my computer and make you a pretty certificate and send it out. 100% of my students who apply would graduate, assuming they send in that fee, and they'd graduate fast. But that doesn't help me know whether they've learned anything, right? And even at your shop, if you think about 2 students who've graduated in the last couple years, even if they both graduated, even if they both took the same length of time, they probably learned different things going through. So at one level, it's important to keep an eye on those student outcomes, the sorts of things that you get asked for on forms. ATS even asks you it on a form, not because there's a bright line, but because we want to know. If you've had one rate for a long time and it changes, we're going to ask why, because we're curious. But the piece that I want to talk most about is about the student learning outcome. We want to know what our students are learning and how we're doing with teaching them. The last piece of the bureaucracy, and those of you who've seen me give a presentation have probably heard this too many times, but as you go back to your shop, it's sometimes helpful too to remind folks that ATS isn't the 6 of us with the little gold name tags this week. ATS is a membership organization. The commission standards come from the membership. They're approved by the membership. Visiting teams are made of folks from member schools, including many of you who've done that work. The decisions are made by our Board of Commissioners who come out of member schools. Any one of your schools could choose to not to be part of ATS next year. That's your right as a member. The membership as a whole could, I might need my colleagues to cover their ears for a moment, but the membership as a whole could say, you know what, next batch of the standards, we don't want assessment at all. We're not going to talk about assessment. We're going to talk about other things. Now, it could be then that ATS would no longer be recognized by other agencies that would allow some of you to have your federal funds, but there's nothing in it that's not coming from the membership. even the standards that come out of the Department of Ed that Tom will talk about later, are kind of on behalf of the membership, because the membership has a service that then comes through federal aid and other things. So it's a bureaucratic thing in part because bureaucracies make bureaucracies, but at its whole, the commission standards are the association, you all's sense of what the best practices and aspirational goals are. So rather than thinking about boredom and bureaucracy and burnout, when I do these presentations, I always wonder, how can we think and act differently? And again, this is my piece coming in as a theologian and as an educator. I don't like to write reports for the sake of writing reports. I'm not that into statistics myself, but I'm about student learning. That matters to me. So how can we think about this from a student learning perspective? And I'll often highlight, and particularly when I'm working with young faculty, so this may be familiar already for some of you, but I like to highlight first off that assessment is a natural and scholarly act. We as educators desire for our students to learn something or to have an experience or to grow in some sort of way. Most of us wouldn't be in this work if that wasn't our goal. I had a couple people at my school that maybe that wasn't their main goal when they stood up in front of a classroom. You might know of a few folks like that. But for most of us, we want students to learn. And so quite naturally, what we do then, when we have an experience with a student, whether it's in a classroom or somewhere else, is we wonder, what did they learn? Did they learn the sorts of things I'm hoping that they learned? Are they growing in the ways that we as a community are hoping that they grow? And if not, what can we tweak? And when I'm working with faculty in particular, I'll highlight that that's often a really appropriate role for those of us who identify as scholars. We know a field, or we know an area of practice, or we're an experienced person in pastoring or leadering or something else. So we have some sense of judging, some perspective, a lens that's unique and important as to whether or not students are actually learning the things they need to learn. It's an educational act, not a bureaucratic act. I also like to talk about the link between assessment and mission. I know sometimes schools will feel like assessment keeps us from the important work, which is working with students. But it's actually part of saying, what is it that we want to do as an institution? How well are we doing it, and how could we do it better? I'll play with that a little bit more in a moment. I also always like to highlight that assessment is important when we're thinking about working with diverse learners. And this can be diverse in all sorts of different ways, whether that's ethnic and cultural background, whether that's age, whether that's life experience. Many of your faculty, and maybe you, might have kind of a default tendency to either teach the way you were taught or to teach the way you wish you were taught. It's natural, I think, for us to imagine that the people in an audience in a classroom are somewhat like we are. And that's great if they are. And for some of our faculty, maybe that is the experience that they've had, is that the folks in front of them in a class are similar to what their own experience was like in a classroom. But for most of us, that's not actually the case and has never actually been in the case. So assessment gives kind of a peek under the hood. So to say, not just are you having the experience that would work for me, but are you actually learning the sorts of things that I'm hoping you would learn? In that way, assessment also helps us in our work. It helps us know if we're being effective. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But instead of being a hindrance to our work, it's a help in our work. And I always, this is like my test, my own little pre-test, post-test. I think assessment can be fun. Most of the time when I'm talking with a room, they're not so convinced. We'll see if we get there by the end or not. So what can assessment help you do? I'm going to have 4 kind of points that I want to highlight in terms of where I think assessment can be helpful. And as I talk about those, you may hear ideas that might be useful to your own place. So one is, I think about assessment in terms of its ability to describe what we're doing in the classroom, in a degree program, in an institution. As an example, I want to give you this description of a DMIN program. I'll read the text in case it's hard for you to see. This DMIN is a cohort-based and contextually focused program that aims to give ministry professionals the capacity to serve their communities more effectively. Whose description is that? Have I got them here in the room? Am I describing your school? For how many of you does this sound like this could be a description of your school? Anybody have a guess which school this is? This is a legitimate, real DMIN program. Which school is this? Would you have any way of figuring it out? Does this speak at all to the distinctiveness of any particular program? I read a lot of blurbs like this, or institutionally, I'll read, we prepare transformative leaders for the 21st century. To get a blurb like that as a statement of learning goals doesn't actually tell anybody anything about your program that wouldn't be found in every other program. Assessment is a way of drilling down and figuring out what specifically is it about your program that's going to make someone want to go to it. One of the interesting experiences I've had since I joined ATS is a number of my former students from ILIF have contacted me and said, okay, I did the MDiv, I've been out in ministry for a few years, I think I'm ready for something more. Can you recommend a DMIN program to me? Do some of you get those kinds of calls? Maybe it's hard because if they're talking to you, they're probably already thinking about your program. But if you imagine running into somebody in Safeway or Kroger or something like that, how would you, or could you imagine what it would be like to have programs that actually described in really clear detail what a student could get out of that program? Now, some of you already have that, and that's great. But if you don't, you might look at how you describe your program, and is it specific enough in a way that's going to actually be helpful? And then vice versa, is it actually a description that's going to describe the experience that students have in your program? So I always like to think about, as we're doing assessment, it's not just about measuring something that's already there. It's describing what it is that we want to have there in the first place. So why should students choose your program? They're going to be investing time and money. Their communities are going to be investing time and money. What is it about your program that makes it unique? This is another way of thinking about what the learning outcomes are. Learning outcomes kind of sometimes make people bristle to say, I know what I'm doing when I teach. I don't need learning outcomes. But learning outcomes are a way of saying to your stakeholders, whether that's a student or a church community or a donor or another kind of community place, what is it that a student might hope to grow into while they're spending their time with you? In this way, learning outcomes can be both descriptive and aspirational. Occasionally, I'm thinking now of an assessment report I read a couple of weeks ago that said, okay, the outcome of our program is going to be that 60% of our students score at least a B on their constructive theology paper. And again, speaking of the grade inflation that we have, I'm like, if 60% of your students don't score at least a B, I'm concerned for you. That's not going to be super descriptive either, right? But instead to think of how you actually describe the real things that you hope students to learn or to achieve by the end of their program. So describe is one. But we don't want to just describe, we also want to monitor. So to keep an eye, this is the example I just saw, actually, this was on Facebook. There's been a piece in the Chronicle this week of a professor who was supposedly fired for not putting learning outcomes on his syllabus. One of the really helpful comments that came in response to that, I've blurbed here. It's a hypothetical. Did you teach an effective course this semester? Well, I don't know. I think so. Well, what was the intention of the course? What were the students supposed to learn? Or what skills were they supposed to acquire? Well, I don't know. We never stated that. It feels like I taught well, though. That's not a completely uncommon sense, both at the course level and even as an instructor, I would have had a hard time sometimes really articulating what did I want students to have as their experience in this class? What do I want them to walk away with? And sometimes I think we bristle of that because we're thinking, is it just a piece of content? That's not what theological education is about. I'll tweak that again in a minute. But to think about, if I'm going to be keeping an eye on what's going on in my program, I need to know what it is I'm trying to do in my program. And then once I know what I'm trying to do in my program, monitoring through assessment allows me to keep an eye on it. So for example, I know a number of schools have been experiencing either personnel issues or financial challenges, particularly since 2008. Some of my other colleagues are going to talk a little bit about some of these stressors that come on. How do you know if one of those stressors is impacting your program? Well, you might obviously know, right? It might become a really clear kind of either gut sense or explosive sense, or as an educator you know. But there are other little changes that you're asked to make all the time that unless you have a clear sense of assessment, it's going to be hard to measure what the effect is, if any. And again, our perspective on what might be effect might be very different than what our students reflect back to us on what might be an effect. So I might freak out if my dean has said, rather than doing the intensives the first 2 weeks of June, we're going to do them the last 2 weeks of June because that'll conflict less with conferences. That might be a huge impact on me or other instructors. Is it going to impact the learning experience? Well, I don't know. A plan of assessment could help me keep an eye on that. Or I think I've subbed out one book for another in a way that's going to be fantastic. I don't think that's a concern at all. Down the road, though, in the assessment plan, I might start to see, oh, we now are missing a particular voice that had been important to us. So a good plan of assessment lets us monitor those things. And if it's up and running and simple and sustainable, it's just like kind of going in for your doctor's checkup. They look at a bunch of different indicators. If it all looks pretty consistent, great, you're good to go. The other piece that I think monitoring is really important for, again, not from the bureaucratic lens, but for many of us, the way our students come to us is from word of mouth from other students, whether those are alums or the churches where alums have served or other sorts of word of mouth. If I go around saying, you know what, my DMin makes really excellent preachers who keep their audience's engagement and connect to contemporary issues really well, and my alums say, I loved that DMin at my school. It enabled me to be the most responsive pastoral care provider ever. Well, both of those are good outcomes, right? I love my DMin, my student loves the DMin, but the recruitment cycle is going to get all messed up. And then if I'm going in saying one thing about it and they're saying another thing about it, that's going to be really complicated in terms of the future growth of my program. So again, assessment isn't important just to make sure my students are learning what they need to, but for the integrity of the whole program. Third piece, and in some ways this is the most important, this is really the reason we do assessment, is to talk about improvement of student learning. We don't just do it, again, just to do assessment or just to know that we're doing a good job of teaching, but to think about how it is that we improve what we're doing. This is that language of closing the loop. Has anybody not heard of closing the loop? One of the successes, I think, of accrediting, successes put broadly, is that everybody knows now that language of closing the loop. It doesn't always happen effectively, though, right? So by closing the loop, what I'm meaning is this process of identifying the goals, so that's the describe piece, gathering data that hopefully relates to those goals, looking at that data and making sense of it, implementing change, and then looking again at those goals. So that's the loop that we're talking about here. Unfortunately, as I still see at schools, a lot of times what happens is we collect a lot of data, we identify goals, we gather data, we collect a ton of data, and we put it in a file cabinet. I'm sure none of you have a file cabinet that looks like that. But that loop gets kind of stalled somewhere or another. And it could be that the loop is happening really well in your area, but maybe not when it gets to a different level of your institution. So maybe you have a good sense of what's going on in your program, but that's not linking well to the dean's vision or the president's vision or the recruitment office's vision or something like that. It could be that you've got an out-of-sync spot. So you have goals. We're going to prepare transformative leaders for the 21st century. And the data that we're collecting is how well they can write. Well, that's data that's pretty easy to collect. Sometimes it's really depressing to collect. But you can collect that. But does it relate back to your goals very well? So the loop isn't just doing the cycle, but watching the way that each of those pieces align. So as you're thinking about the assessment that's happening at your shop, and particularly around your DMin program, it's helpful, I think sometimes, I'm a visual person, obviously, to draw that kind of cycle. So to say, at my school, here's the goals we've identified. Here's the data that we're collecting. First off, does that data link back up? I know at a lot of places, at least with reports I've been seeing lately, a lot of times the outcomes assessment that happens in a DMin program is looking at the thesis or dissertation. One practice that's common now, I see a lot at least, is that as the first and second readers are reviewing a written project, they maybe also have a rubric, and they're filling out a score sheet as they go along. Do any of you have that happening at your institution? So I'm seeing about half the hands for that. That's great, and there's goals identified, there's data that collected. But again, a lot of times when I look at that, the things that are showing up in that score sheet don't actually match up back with those goals. They happen to be the things you can collect data on, but they might not link back very well. Or they might link back well in a way that's important once. So again, to use my writing example, A lot of schools, as they implemented this sort of thing, they'd have a rubric, how well can the student write or use research? And they're discovering important things like, oh, I actually expected students coming into a program would write well and would know how to use the library. Or they knew how to use the library when they were in a residential MDiv and don't know how to do it as a distance through electronic resources. Or knew how to do it 20 years ago and don't know how to do it today. Or knew how to do it in a different context for philosophy papers, but don't know how to integrate it with contextual learning. So it's great to kind of catch those little errors, but my hunch is that for most of you, you don't have an overall, in your ideas, a program goal that this student will learn to write incredibly good thesis projects. Because for most of your students, they'll write one in their life, right? They may go on to write other sorts of things, but if your whole focus is on how well did they write their DMIN project and is focused in that in a way that's disconnected from the overall goals, well, you can collect all the data you want on that, but that's probably not going to be super helpful. So instead, to think about the kinds of data that are going to match with your goals. So if you want someone who can preach more effectively, or engage contemporary events more productively, or has a greater sense of longevity in their vocation, or has a different sense of call, the goal then is to think about what kinds of data can you collect that'll actually relate back to those goals. So maybe in addition to looking at the thesis, I listen to them preach, or I interview folks from their community, or I follow up with them in 3 years and say, has this given you a different sense of grounding for your vocation? Again, then, so we've collected data that's useful. Then when we go into analyzing that data, we're not just doing it to say 60% got a B, wahoo, we're good. We're looking at it to say, really, are the things that I'm hoping to happen and that my community at a school are hoping to happen, are those actually happening? And then the last piece that was really pushed on in the last few years has been to actually then implement change on a result of it. And I think schools are a lot better at that now. We see that the students can't do research, so we add a research class, or we embed a librarian in a course. But then how do you make the change that's actually related to those other kinds of goals? And then how do you complete the circle? So then to go back and say, are my goals even meaningful and useful, or how do I relate back to that? And then the last piece, and this is part of where my sense as a theologian comes back in, is a sense of nurturing. At the opening, I spoke a little bit about limits. We can't all be good at everything. That may be a shock for a few of you. It took me a while in life to learn I can't be good at everything. Your DMIN program cannot be good at everything. It will not meet the needs of absolutely every student who picks up the phone and calls you. It's incredibly helpful, I think, as an administrator, as a teacher, as an institution, to know what those things are that you're good at, or those things are that are important to you. And then to be able to say, and these other things actually are not. At my institution, we had a DMIN for quite a few years. We don't anymore. But I was a DMIN thesis reader, and I would read projects that had nothing to do with the strengths of what our program was. And at some levels, that's fine. You're going to have students who wander their way through, and they didn't even know where they were headed when they started. So how could you? But if student after student comes to you thinking they're going to do something that's not your area, again, I would look to see if there's a mismatch in the identification of goals or in the sense of what you're trying to do. To think even about the assessment level, so say, for example, I had this robust assessment. I was interviewing congregations to see, did their preacher actually improve? Well, maybe they didn't, and maybe then I come back to say, is this really a strength of ours as an institution? And maybe we should stop promising this, and we should measure something else instead. So again, to think about what is it you're trying to do, and then to nurture those parts into being, and to let go of some of those other pieces. As you're thinking of your own program, you might think about what makes it strong and worthwhile and valuable, and how do you affirm those pieces, how do you measure and monitor and keep track of those, and let go of the other things. I've mentioned a couple of examples as I've gone along, but I also at this point always want to mention to folks that this includes the intangible sorts of things. Those of us who don't have a statistical brain sometimes will link onto the things we actually can measure, and we measure that because we know how to measure it, and we can do that. But I don't want faculties or programs to say we can only think about goals that can be measured in that yardstick sort of way. I want to think about the ability to have goals that include things like we want our students to have a particular experience that they can then build on. Many of you do intensives with a cohort. That experience in and of itself, there's something valuable there, isn't it? That maybe then is something that you would hope that that student then would carry on with, either as part of their own professional support or as something they might replicate in their home community. You can make that into a learning goal and then think about the ways that you can assess that, not with a yardstick, but with other sorts of qualitative inputs, and then how you continue to keep an eye on, is that actually happening? Are they continuing to have that experience down the road, or was it a one-time lovely experience while they were with you? Same sort of thing. We often don't talk about character, but theological schools are often all about character. So if you want a student to grow in their faith life, or in their ability to deal with conflict, or their ability to nurture themselves in the midst of difficult situations, go ahead and name that as a program goal and say, well, how would I know it if I saw it? And then how can I continue to attend to that? It doesn't all have to be content knowledge or testable. So did anybody catch on my lovely little acronym there? This is your thing for holding on. My sense, again, as I'm kind of coming to a close here, is to say it really is all about the educational piece. So to think about this as educators and to think about it from the lens of assessment is something that's actually going to help you in education. In this presentation, which again we'll make available to you afterwards, I've got some resources highlighted. Some of these will be familiar to you, and some of them are just examples. In the ATS Commission standards, there is a section in the educational standard that's all about educational assessment. The more I've worked with it, I really appreciate it because it talks really in some ways that are coaching as much as regulatory in terms of thinking about different kinds of instruments and different kinds of stakeholder involvement. You might also find it helpful to look at the Doctor of Ministry standard that includes some section on educational assessment. Inside the ATS Self-Study Handbook, we have a section that's particularly about assessment. And so even if you're not in the midst of a self-study, that can be a really helpful text to think about the nitty-gritties. What's a rubric? How do I do it? What's a benchmark? Isn't grading a course enough in terms of assessment? No, it's not, and that explains why. And inside that handbook is a checklist that, again, is a way to monitor, not to impose, but to say, here are the things we're doing well, and here are the areas we might grow. Those of you who know a lot about assessment might also know there's a huge literature out there of books on assessment, of guides of assessment, of websites on assessment. So there's a lot of other information that you can find. These are a few of the ones that I found really helpful. And I think that's actually where I'm going to stop because I want to make sure we have time for conversation. But I'd invite, actually, first off, anybody who's got a good example that I've missed or a good practice that I've missed. And then I'd be happy to move from there into questions.
Debbie, I have one.
Yes.
Okay, so at the project stage you mentioned is where you see a lot of assessments taking place. We do the same thing at our place. One of the things we've started doing just this past year, we want to repeat it every year, so this is my question.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we have an evaluation form, which is very much a rubric, that our faculty mentor, advisor, along with the two readers for the project report, fill out, and we collect that for each one. All right, then when we do our assessment, is it okay to do, if we have, let's say we have 20 graduates, is it okay to do a sampling of those, or should we try to do it for every one? That's my first question. And then when we look at all of the parts of the rubric, should we assess everything, or should we do some randoms along with that? You understand my second part question?
Yep. So I don't know if everybody could hear Reggie's question, but I'm going to give an answer, and if my answer doesn't make sense, ask me. So one of the pieces was about whether, once you're looking at a group of students, do you need to, once you've collected that assessment data, do you need to look carefully at the data from each and every one of those students, or can you do a subset of them? And I'm going to give a sideways answer, and one part of that is that ATS, the commission, doesn't tell you how to do assessment. So for most of you, it's a matter of figuring out what's going to make the most sense in your context. Some of you might be working with student cohorts where you have 3 or 4 graduates a year. in which case both of you've got the gift that you can look at all 3 or 4 of those rather closely without getting overwhelmed, and the complexity that any one of those can really skew things, right, and not give you an overall typical. For those kinds of programs, you might want to be glancing at it every year, and then maybe every 3 years looking at everything together when you've got a larger set. For a school that's got a slightly larger group, again, if I've got maybe 20 or even 40, I might want to glance at all of it because I want to get a sense of where's everybody. But then I might look closely at a sample within that. One of the pieces of the educational standard for the commission is it talks about the need to assess your own assessment plan. And that sounds bureaucratic and really scary, right? You're going to get in this endless loop of assessing and assessing. But that's a way of saying, is it working for you? Would you have enough information from what you're getting to monitor if something was going wrong, to have a sense of whether you're actually improving, to know what you need to know? If I've just done a curricular revision, I'm going to look at everything from every student for a couple years to make sure that everything's going okay. If this is a program that's been up and running for a while, the students are pretty consistent in terms of the folks coming in, the faculty are pretty consistent, I maybe can dip in every couple years or with a small subset at a time. So any of that is fine. The same sort of thing, if you've got 3 learning goals, 6 learning goals, 12 learning goals, as you're ramping up, you might find it really helpful to look broadly at all of it all at once, but then you might settle into a rhythm where you look at in a focused way, often enough still that you can catch something if you need to, but not so often that you put your heads on your desk when the data comes out because it's exactly the same as it was before. And it may be that the rubrics that you've used for a while, every few years also themselves need to be refreshed. It's nice to get longitudinal data, so to say for the past 20 years, all of our students are great with library research. But also if for the past 20 years, all of your students have been great for library research, maybe you can stop asking that question and ask something else. So that's a long way of saying there's not a right and wrong answer, but there are some principles underneath it to be thinking about as you're working with what you're working with. Yeah. Lori.
I'm finding a tension within me as I was processing what you were saying. I'm feeling good about the simple and sustainable. Mm-hmm. And I feel we've got rules in place and we've got ownership of them, and et cetera. But if I can tell a sideways story, my son did an MBA at Darden in Virginia. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting being in a business environment and how concerned they were with character formation. Mm-hmm. And they developed these very tight-knit cohorts for this 2-year program, and they have classrooms somewhat like this. And my son told me that they also have parents' weekends, which I still can't, I'm still processing.
Do they ask you for money at that time?
No, they didn't.
Ah.
They really didn't. I mean, this school's got its act together, right? But anyways, my son was telling me that in this kind of cohort room like this, you have 20 in a cohort, and they do their case studies week by week. And my son told me that they had the annual course evaluations, or the semester course evaluations, and they filled them out in December. They came back at the end of January, and one of the things they'd all mentioned was the desks were too tight and they couldn't put their laptops, and they weren't comfortable. They came back in January, all the desks had been removed, new desks, and a whole new architectural scheme had been put into place. Oh. I was blown away. Now, Virginia's got money we don't have, so that's, part of me sat there and looked enviously at them. But I really admired the fertile creativity of their thinking, that they would make such a quick move to create an environment where the communities and the cohorts could develop. I really struggle because I want it sustainable and simple, because I'm barely sustained and pretty simple with my thinking. But how to nurture that and also nurture a creative environment where you're thinking about the unexpected possibilities.
That's a great way of highlighting, again, a whole bunch of different things. And so one of them is, as you're talking, I'm reminded that this level of assessment that I'm talking about is us assessing ourselves as teachers, as a program, as an institution. And so in that kind of assessment, it might even be helpful for those of you who supervise people to think about how you assess somebody else. There are ways in which we give and get quick and immediate feedback. Sometimes that's really informal. If I walked in today and after 5 minutes you all had your heads down, I would have turned off my presentation and started having a conversation, right? So, and all of us as people do that. That's probably not written into any assessment plan, but there is a level at which both the informal and the quick happen. There also is a space for timeliness. So if I'm hearing from a cohort of students that something's not working, I don't really want to wait till the next 3-year cycle or when I've interviewed them as alums 3 years out to get that information to make that change. Because even though I'm assessing my program, I also want to serve that cohort really well. So if I'm doing course evals, or if I'm doing midpoint interviews, or if I'm doing something else where I'm getting feedback, I might want to make a more immediate response. And even back to Reggie's question, there may be learning goals that I review on a cycle, but when something triggers, I bring it up more quickly. Or maybe I've got something that I do every single year or twice a year even, and other things that are more the long-term big picture. So I think it's helpful, and this may be helpful too to highlight for faculty, that even with the program review piece, we do make some changes right away, but sometimes we don't. So part of an assessment plan is, so for the pieces we might not otherwise do, like let's look at our grads 3 years out and see if they really are achieving the sorts of things we hoped they would. Or that let's look really clearly at this content area and see if it's being delivered, so that we're also not just troubleshooting. I think a lot of us, when we do program level assessment, at least me when I was an academic dean, a lot of what we did was troubleshooting. We would review a part of the curriculum if a faculty member left. But if that faculty member was 40 years, we wouldn't review that part of the curriculum. Or we would review our facilities when we had a new donation and we're moving space around, but we wouldn't review it on an ongoing basis. So part of this is to fill in so that I'm not just going to the emergency room when I'm sick, but I also am visiting the doctor on a regular basis. So think of all those levels together. So thank you for complicating that in that good way. Other things. Let me come up here to Wanda, and then I'll come back to you. Yeah.
I think my takeaway from your presentation so far is that assessment is really relational. Mm-hmm. And so for me to think about it that way, it takes a little bit of pressure off of me. And then I think, is it the chicken? Did the chicken or the egg come first? Mm-hmm. Is it that I'm going to create an assessment and move from that, or am I creating assessment out of the relationships that are being developed, whether they are with students, whether it's about a relationship with the program itself? But I like the idea of thinking about the fact that relationships are important. How is the relationship working? So this was very helpful to me.
Good. And I think as you're talking, to remember you said this as part of it, I want to highlight that part of it is the relationship not just between Wanda and her student or me and a student, but between the program and the cohort of students. Again, as a dean, I got to know the best students and the worst students. Some of you as program directors, I'm sure, have never had that experience, but the ones in your office might be the ones who are struggling the most, or the ones who are volunteering. So this is a way of looking more broadly across. So to think of the relationship with the whole, not the ones that I'm easiest or most forced to relate with. And then I do love that thinking of relationship. A lot of times if I'm working with a school that maybe has had a really unhelpful assessment plan and there's a lot of faculty resistance and they think this doesn't help us and we shouldn't do it, we want to get back to teaching and learning, I'll say to them, tell me about your best graduate. And their faces start glowing, right? Because it is a little bit of that relationship piece. And they start telling me these incredible stories. And I'll ask about a different one and a different one. And then I'll say, and tell me about a student that just didn't seem that well served by your program. And then again, it's a relationship. You hear the sadness or you hear the frustration. And to start an assessment plan with that and to say, what kind of graduate would we be most proud of? And then to open it up to say, and then it's also just not me and them, it's their church community, and it's their life experience, and it's the whole greater world beyond just what I can do as one person. But to start to build those layers of relationship out, that's really helpful. Yeah, thanks. I had a hand in the back.
Yeah, my experience with assessment, it seems that almost everything is a quantitative approach to measuring, gathering data. And I've wondered that if, in addition to that, if perhaps some in-depth interviews with a sample of graduates or or something, we might mine some data that we simply can't get from surveys and that. Do you know,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that? Do you know of anybody doing something like that?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things in the educational standard is it talks about the need for both qualitative and quantitative data. And I think partly because of our institutional life and sometimes the folks who end up directing assessment programs, partly because of the stresses we feel from accrediting agencies, including regional accreditors or other sorts of folks, and in part because of our own exhaustion, it's easy, in some ways easy, to send out surveys or to do rubrics and to tally up a lot of numbers. And that's important, and I don't want to let go of that, but we often talk about the need for both stories and statistics. So to give a couple of those exemplars that say either here is what our proudest graduate or our hypothetical graduate is like, or in either a self-study or an ongoing assessment report, to have a couple quotes from students, even with Lori's example, to hear my imagination went to a hypothetical student trying to get a laptop, a textbook, and a coffee mug on a desk. That's more useful to me than 92% of students said the desks were too small. So the way to integrate stories, sometimes, again, for a faculty that's been reluctant to do assessment or hasn't done it well, to bring in a group of alums and do a fishbowl. Let the 6 of them sit in the middle with a facilitator, let everybody else sit on the outside, and hear, and have maybe the facilitator to say, have you used your coursework in your vocation? If so, what do you remember using? Is there something else, and that can be way more useful to a faculty, and then might spurn more statistics. So, okay, these 6 said this. Let's interview everybody or do a survey of everybody. But definitely putting them together in ways that are engaging. Yeah, good. Up front here.
Have you considered ATS posting a resource site where schools could post examples of direct assessment tools they're using, especially in the DMIN? My assessment committee chair has asked me, we really need to, all the regional accreditors are now going and shifting away from the satisfaction surveys, the ESQ, the GSQs, things like that, into direct assessment. It's coming down the pipe. We got zinged on it pretty badly this time, and now we're back up to where it should be, but we need more direct assessment in theological education is what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Have you thought about having a resource page?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to answer 5 questions in the midst of one. I apologize for that. So one is the commission standards right now actually require both direct and indirect measures. So you all are zinging each other around this too. In terms of resources that we do have, this gives me a plug to blurb that we have an assessment listserv at ATS. So again, in the ATS, there's 2 different places to look for assessment information. If you don't find it, just email me and I'll link you to the right place. But under the programs, there's a section for assessment directors. And even if that's not a job title, if you're involved with assessment, and there are some resources there, including the assessment guide that I've mentioned, a listserv, and the listserv at present, I think, is the most helpful thing for something like that, because I'll see a program director of X and such program to say, does anybody have some really good ideas for direct measures relating to X and Y? I think the commission's been a little reluctant to put best practices up because it's also in the commission standards that assessment needs to be done in light of the mission and context of each school. And until schools have a lot more confidence with assessment, the piece that often makes me nervous is that schools will say, I'm going to take Southwestern's assessment plan and use it at Bright Divinity School, and then I'm going to use that at St. Joseph Seminary, and that doesn't serve stakeholders. The assessment guide that I mentioned does have some samples, sample rubrics, samples about benchmarks, sample assessment reports. But you also, all of my colleagues are here and are hearing this kind of request for samples, and we'll continue to have those conversations. So I think I have time for maybe one more question, if there is one. Okay, yeah.
My concern is the sustainability of qualitative data. Even your exams are almost exclusively quantitative, and then when we switch to qualitative, we talk about having an example of the best students or having a group of 6 people come in. If you're running a large program, that's the tendency, of course, to make it quantitative. You take what should have been long things that you should read and kind of consider and just reduce that to 10 questions, and then you can check them off the box and you're done with it. having personnel to continue to read this, maybe even stay in contact with students that graduated 5, 6, 10 years ago, is quite resource, whatever, requires a lot of resource. I wonder how we do that. I've seen a lot of really great tests and really great kind of measurement tools be turned into quick little checkboxes. And certainly that's true even with content assessment. Not with how good are they at using the library, how well do they read, but true content. What did they learn in this class? And so instead of them writing an essay, we want to test 200 students. So we check on these points if they're good. How do we avoid that? How do we find some kind of sustainable model with the resources that day?
Yeah, that's a great place, again, to be wrestling with, because every school's kind of context for that's going to be a little bit different. One thought I have, first off, is to name that you probably already do have a lot of qualitative data, but it's probably informal. So the relationship, as Wanda said, the relationship that faculty have with students, particularly doctoral students, their advisor, their readers, their mentors, folks who write them recommendation letters, those are qualitative resources. Another is to think at a big institution, there are probably places in which your institution touches your alum that may be outside of your program. So whether that's in fundraising or in an alumni office, or if there is an IR department or something else, that for them there's also some value in staying looped in with alums as recruiting tools. You might be using alums from your DMin as field supervisors in your MDiv. You may have other points of touch that then if you come in for 20 minutes at an alumni gathering every 2 years, there's a really rich source for qualitative data. I see your hands.
I get that. I mean, I get that, and we do that. And I could gather, but getting a faculty to write this down in some kind of measurable, usable, qualitative form, and do that with fundraisers and whatever you have is a major undertaking. If not, just a wall that's not going to happen.
Well, and that's again, it's different for every school, so I hate to answer too much, but like I could imagine some of that might already be happening informally. So if you go and are a guest preacher somewhere and have the opportunity then to have lunch with one of your grads, if there's a place then, either like maybe I fill out a little half sheet when I come to campus, say I interacted with so-and-so, they said this and this, put it in a little box. Or at a faculty meeting, I know some faculties that pray for their students, right? So as part of that gathering of prayers, to have somebody who just takes some notes that then comes back into the assessment report. Or if your faculty discuss the statisticals, to say, as we're looking at all these numbers, does anybody have some examples of stories they can help to flesh out some of these things we're talking about with data? So I get the sense, and many of us who are driven to do more and more, it's easy to think, I'm Methodist. We need to have a committee for this. We need to have 5 committees for this, and we need to have funds for it and whatever. That could be a best practice at some places, and it may even be a year that you put something else on hold so that you can do more of that. But to also think of, are there spots organically that you can fill that in? I see that I'm out of time. I could keep going for forever, but I'm guessing people want the coffee break. So I'll be around for a bit. And again, my colleagues are here. We would love to continue these conversations with you. So thank you very much.